History is full of moments when ordinary people stood tall and refused to stay silent. From streets to bridges, from islands to secret paths, these acts of courage changed America forever. The Boston Massacre. Long before freedom came, anger was already growing in the streets. British soldiers had been sent to Boston to keep order, but people did not like being watched and controlled in their own town. Crowds shouted at the soldiers, throwing snowballs and even small rocks. One cold March night in 1770, the tension broke. Soldiers fired into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed and more were hurt. The people called it the Boston Massacre, and they told the story everywhere. It showed how the king's rule was turning deadly. From that night on, many in the colonies felt more afraid of British power, but fear also pushed them to speak out. The event spread in newspapers, and drawings showed soldiers attacking unarmed townspeople. The British said the soldiers acted in self-defense, but the people of Boston saw it as murder. This blood on the streets planted the thought that life under British control was no longer safe, and soon the anger lit a fire that would not go out. The Declaration of Independence. That fire grew until leaders from the colonies gathered in Philadelphia in 1776. They had argued for years, writing letters, sending pleas to the king, and asking for fair treatment. But nothing changed. At last, they decided to break away. In the summer heat, men like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin worked on a document that would tell the world their decision. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was finished. It said that all people are created equal and have rights that cannot be taken away. It declared the colonies free from British rule. This was not just a piece of paper. It was a brave announcement that the United States was now its own nation. Copies were read aloud in towns, and bells rang as people cheered. The choice was dangerous because Britain had the strongest army in the world, but the colonists were ready to risk everything for liberty. The voices of independence echoed far beyond America. Other nations like France saw the courage of the colonies and later gave their support. The Declaration was not only an act of defiance, but also a promise of a new beginning. Montgomery Bus Boycott. Almost 2 centuries later, another fight for freedom rose, but this time it was inside America itself. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, people faced unfair laws called segregation. Black Americans were forced to sit at the back of buses, while white passengers took the front. One evening, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. She was arrested, and the news spread quickly. Her brave stand sparked the Montgomery Bus Boycott. For more than a year, Black families walked, shared rides, and found other ways to get to work and school. They refused to ride the buses until the unfair rule was changed. The boycott showed unity and strength. It also brought a young pastor, Martin Luther King Jr., into the national spotlight. Finally, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was illegal. The victory was not only about buses, it was about dignity, respect, and the power of peaceful protest. This act of defiance proved that when people joined together, they could shake even the deepest injustices. Boston Tea Party. Long before Rosa Parks, tea had played its own role in rebellion. In 1773, Britain passed a law forcing colonists to buy taxed tea from the East India Company. The people of Boston saw this as another way the king tried to control them. Angry citizens gathered at the harbor. On the night of December 16th, men dressed as Native Americans boarded ships filled with tea. They worked fast, breaking open chests and dumping the leaves into the water. The harbor turned dark with tea, enough to make thousands of cups. The protest shocked Britain and thrilled colonists. It showed that people were ready to act boldly, not just talk. The punishment came quickly. Britain closed Boston's port and sent more troops. But instead of scaring the colonies, it pushed them closer together. The Boston Tea Party became a symbol that unfair laws would be met with daring resistance. March on Washington. From tea in the harbor to footsteps in the streets, the spirit of defiance carried on. In 1963, thousands of people traveled to Washington, D.C. to demand civil rights. Families, workers, and students came together, holding signs and singing songs. The crowd stretched from the Lincoln Memorial to the Washington Monument. On that historic day, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. He spoke of a nation where children would not be judged by their skin, but by their character. The March on Washington was not only about laws, but about hope, justice, and unity. The peaceful gathering pushed the government to act, leading to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The march showed the world that the fight for freedom never ended with independence from Britain. It lived on in every act of courage, every protest, and every voice that rose against injustice. Stonewall Uprising. In the summer of 1969, fire lit the streets of New York, not from flames, but from courage. At the Stonewall Inn, a bar in Greenwich Village, police stormed in just after midnight on June 28th. They pushed people, arrested some, and treated many cruelly just because they were gay or dressed differently. Normally, people would scatter and hide, but that night the crowd stayed. They shouted, they fought back, and they threw coins, bottles, and even bricks. Police were forced to lock themselves inside the bar, while angry protesters tried to push back the walls of fear that had ruled for too long. The clash spread into days of marching, shouting, and standing strong in the streets. Out of this, a new voice rose, saying loudly that being gay was nothing to be ashamed of, and that freedom belonged to everyone. From that fight in New York, the story of Defiance marched forward into the next great battle. Women's Suffrage March on Washington, 1913. On March 3, 1913, just before a new president was sworn in, Washington, D.C. filled with footsteps of women who would not be silent. Thousands marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, led by Inez Milholland, on a white horse shining like a beacon of hope. She wore a flowing white cape and crown, showing the world that women were ready to claim their place in democracy. Behind her came floats, banners, and groups from every state, each one calling out the great demand, the right to vote. But the streets were not safe. Men crowded in, shouted insults, and pushed the marchers. Police stood by, some even laughing, while the women locked arms and forced their way forward. Black women like Ida B. Wells Barnett refused to be pushed to the back, stepping proudly into the line with their state groups. Native voices also marched, showing that justice must be equal for all. Even though the crowd tried to stop them, the march ended with music and a great display of liberty at the Treasury Building. Selma to Montgomery marches. Next up, in 1965, the roads of Alabama became rivers of bravery. Local black citizens in Selma had tried again and again to register to vote, but Sheriff Jim Clark and others used fear to stop them. Then came the march. On March the 7th, hundreds walked toward Montgomery, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Waiting for them were state troopers and deputies with clubs and tear gas. They attacked, beat, and chased the marchers. That day was called Bloody Sunday. Pictures and films of the violence spread across the nation, showing the world the pain of people asking only for the right to vote. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. soon led thousands more to return to the bridge. This time they knelt, prayed, and turned back, refusing to fight hate with hate. Days later, with court orders and federal protection, the marchers tried again. Step by step, mile after mile, they walked the full 54 miles until they reached Montgomery. By the end, 25,000 people stood together, their voices rising in unity. Out of this long march came the Voting Rights Act of 1965, breaking down one of the strongest walls of injustice in America. From the southern bridges of Alabama, the Trail of Defiance crossed the waters to an island in California, where another group demanded land promised long ago. Occupation of Alcatraz, 1969 to 1971. On November 20th, 1969, small boats carried a powerful message across San Francisco Bay. Native activists, calling themselves Indians of all tribes, landed on Alcatraz Island. They said the land, once a prison and now abandoned, belonged to Native peoples by old treaty rights. They claimed it peacefully, offering the government just pennies per acre, the same unfair price once paid to their ancestors. But this time they would not leave so easily. For 19 months, men, women, and children lived on the island. They built a small community, shared food, and used their voices to demand respect. Their leader, Richard Oakes, became a symbol of hope, though tragedy later struck when he was killed. Even with hardships, the occupation awakened the nation. It showed that Native voices were not lost and would not be silenced. The Underground Railroad. Finally, long before these marches, another fight for freedom moved quietly under the cover of night. The Underground Railroad was not made of tracks or trains, but of hidden houses, barns, and churches. Runaways fleeing slavery in the South followed secret signs, a lantern in a window, a flag on a fence, that told them it was safe to stop. Brave conductors risked prison and fines to guide them, feeding and sheltering them, then sending them on to the next stop. Detroit became one of the last doors to freedom, with Canada just across the river, where slavery was banned. Leaders like George the Baptiste used even steamships to ferry people across, while black churches hid thousands who passed through. Every journey was dangerous because slave catchers could still grab people even in the North. Yet still, men, women, and children walked in darkness toward a brighter land. With every step, they defied chains and carried the dream of liberty across miles of fear. If you enjoyed this journey through history's boldest acts of defiance, don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories like this.